New approach to science communication.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to try to stay out of the blinding light, so I'm not pace too much. So thank you for that introduction, Michael. I have a very interdisciplinary background, and I came to be a communication researcher in a kind of unusual way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of my background and my interdisciplinary work before I really get into the talk. So as Michael said, when I graduated from college with a degree in studio art and painting, I moved to New York to become a set designer and scenic artist, and I did that for some time in New York. And then on a whim, as one does in one's 20s, I started a theater company called Redshift Productions with a person that I had been dating for several months. It worked out fine. That person's now my partner. Is actually here today. But we continue to build Redshift Productions. Our first full-length production, to give you a sense of the kind of work we did, was called Galileo: The Emotional Life of a Spacecraft. It was a rock opera about the Galileo mission to Jupiter, sung from the perspective of the ship. And it was a little bit wild and a little bit weird. So those are the kinds of projects we did. We then went on to develop a project through devised theater, which, if you haven't heard of it before, is when you, instead of beginning with a script, begin with a company of performers and artists and work together to develop a script. We assembled a cast of improvisational actors, and we decided we were going to teach ourselves science and make a show about it, and that failed miserably. Total failure. So we sent notifications to all of the science departments and all of the universities in New York City, and we got a few responses, mostly postdocs. So this is Dan, who is a lovely postdoc in astrophysics, who came and spoke with our group and actually helped us come up with the name for the eventual show we wrote, which was Happy Hour at the Event Horizon, which was based in improv. We enjoyed working with the scientists so much. We had a scientist come up and do a moment of improv in the show every night, based on a game that we developed. This was a fun project, but I have to say, when we first started working with scientists and bringing them into the room, we failed miserably, right? And so figuring out how to actually get artists and scientists to collaborate, to work together, and to talk to each other became such a fascinating process that I went back to grad school to study precisely that. I went back, and I was very fortunate. I had a lot of flexibility and freedom. So most of my PhD work was in artist-scientist collaboration. Meanwhile, we kept running Redshift Productions, kept doing projects, and started doing workshops in science communication. This is a workshop we did for NICENet, the Nanoscale Informal Science Education Network. Now it's been renamed the National, because nanoscience is no longer in vogue. But we did a workshop that got people moving and up on their feet and thought about how to express scientific concepts through movement. This is a performance we did with Nobel laureate Roald Hoffmann. Quite proud of this. We got him to play with us in a game we call PowerPoint, which is when a scientist will give a lecture, but instead of having their own slides, they have several actors who act out their slides. And this ended up being a great deal of fun for Roald, and it was really fun for us to work with him. So I was doing all of that while I was studying, and when I was studying, I was fortunate enough to have a lot of different kinds of experiences. So the major part of my work was this art-science collaboration. So this is my first big project, ended up being my master's thesis. I had 4 groups of artists and scientists that I paired and had them work together to create short performances. This is a particular collaboration between a theoretical physicist and a poet. And another one, this was a more extended project, called Dance of Scales, another physicist. Physicists really liked us, really liked to work on these kinds of things. So this was an experimental physicist and a choreographer who developed this over the course of a year. And I write extensively about that in one of the chapters of the book, but I'm not going to have much of a chance to talk about it today. But All of these activities, in conjunction with the other work that I did, for example, I was also involved in design through the Interaction Design Laboratory at Cornell in the Information Science Department, where I designed mobile applications for public engagement with science and for fun and for other things. So this was a lot of my summer research funding was to do this kind of work. So I really got to know the design literature, design methodologies, and I got really interested in, as I'll get to later, Dewey's theory of aesthetics, which we used when developing Mobi, which was an app that that generated music that changed based on how you moved. So these were the kinds of projects that I did. I also, ahead of myself, I also worked a lot in the, my degree was in the communication department, studying communication scholarship and science and technology studies. So I had this sort of range of interests that all came together around ideas of science comm. And they informed my views and the way that I research science comm in, I think, unique ways, right? So first, when I talk about science communication, I'm talking about the ways in which scientific ideas and content are presented and taken up by the public, right? And so this is a whole range of activities itself that ranges from science journalism to public debates around science policy to popularization and popular science books, informal science learning that happens in museums. It's this whole constellation of activities, each with their own sort of practices and theories and work, but they come together in a sort of umbrella of science communication. There are some sort of overarching trends from the past 60 years, right? And so one of the big overarching trends is that when we began thinking about how we communicate science back in the 50s and 60s, we were very much concerned with science literacy. We were concerned with disseminating scientific knowledge. And over the past 60 years, that has transformed a bit. We've left ideas of public understanding of science and science literacy have been sort of lumped together and called deficit models. Have you ever heard this term before? Deficit models of science? Yeah, deficit models of science thinking, right? So these are the ideas that the public has a lack of knowledge. And if their heads are empty, if we fill their empty heads, then all will be right? We will have convinced them science is worthwhile, they will appreciate it, and they will make the right decisions, right? And this is most of the social science research that we've done. Most of the work that we've done has said no, that's not the case, right? The transition that we made in the 1990s was towards public engagement, right, or a dialogue model. We were interested in not just disseminating information, right, top down, downstream, but also learning from publics. So there was a real push for upstream engagement. How do we change this into a dialogue? How do we learn from people and find out what they're interested in and what they're curious about and find out what their concerns are, right? And so that's been the big sort of overarching push. Within that, what we've seen in research has been a slow turn towards, not slow, but a turn towards cognitive and social science to understand what has come to pass, right? One of the reasons for this shift was that areas of science were coming up that were contested, right? Stem cell research, nanotechnology, areas that didn't have simple explanations and couldn't just be appreciated, but we had to make policy around them, right? And so so a lot of science became controversial or contentious. So this area of social and cognitive science started thinking about and talking about things like cultural cognition of risks and the ways that individuals take their understandings of scientific concepts are shaped by their values rather than vice versa, right? So we start to see studies that show that increased access to information does not promote appreciation for science, but rather enhances polarity, right? So for example, in climate change, the more you know about climate change, the more polarized your view will be, right? It's not that you will have a more positive view of efforts to address climate change, but you will have a more polarized view right? We start to see studies on the boomerang effect, right? Studies that show the way the person who is disseminating the information matters. So we see a lot of these kinds of studies, a lot of great work. In practice, what this meant was that science communication trainings for scientists became increasingly about storytelling, about narrative, about humor, about affect, and about how to make emotional connections, how to show empathy. In museums and informal science learning, there was a push towards interactivity and engagement rather than dissemination. So these are all trends, these trends all sort of follow these themes. But to me, there was something a little bit missing, right? These overarching ideas, deficit versus engagement, didn't really account and don't really address all of the different research that was coming out, all of this really good research that has been coming out about what's really happening in science communication. So I wanted to ask, what would it mean to think about a new model, right? In Science Comm, we talk about these as models. So what would it mean to think about a new model? What would a new model look like? And Dewey's theory of experience, still sitting in the back of my head, and I was thinking about all of these aspects of science communication that are coming to the fore, like values, affect, humor, and how they have been used, right, especially in the practice of science communication in these trainings. When we talk about art science, which is another area of research that I'm interested in, we call this instrumentalization, right? We call this appropriating tools, right? Appropriating the tools of the arts to do the work of conveying scientific information, right? And so it occurs to me that what we're really doing is by thinking we're using these stories or our work to aid in our transmissions, we're reducing important aspects of the human experience to tactics, right? We're embracing their usefulness, but we're rejecting their value. So how do we build a model that takes into account the value of these things? And so I turned back to Dewey. So as I said, I first encountered Dewey during this Mo Boogie, this study of this app we built for Android phones. We happen to have 100 Android phones in the lab, and my supervisor said, make something for these. And we became interested in how would you use a phone that would encourage movement instead of staring at a screen. And so we developed this app that that music played, and as you moved it, it was registering movement on 3 axes of the phone, and it was changing the music. And we gave it to 100 summer camp kids in summer camp and their counselors, and we let them play with it. And we watched them and we asked them questions. And we ended up talking about acts of expression, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is part of Dewey's theory, which is this idea that we are driven to express ourselves in meaningful ways. And when we do this, we have experiences. So I was thinking about Dewey. I went back and reread Dewey, and I thought, well, let's think about what it would mean to conceptualize science communication as aesthetic experience. So what Dewey says about experience is that we are in a constant state of experiencing the world. We're always moving through the world and experiencing it. But we have these moments, which he calls aesthetic experiences. It's an experience and aesthetic experience that somehow have a sense of wholeness, a sense of completion to them, that are somehow set apart from the normal movement through the world of experience. And because they are set apart, we reflect on them, we make meaning out of them, somehow they mean something to us. And then they become a part of our lived experience and inform us in the future, right? And so here's we have an experience when the material experienced runs its course to fulfillment. Then and only then is it integrated within and demarcated in the general stream of experience from other experiences, right? And so that's a sort of a general idea of what he thinks about experience. And this comes from his pragmatist background, in which the primary way we know the world is through experience, right? This is experience is very important to Dewey, not just in the arts, but also in education and in understanding nature and science, right? So I thought, okay, so what If I were to pull out some principles for science communication, I would pull out 3 principles that really define what an experience model of science communication would look like. And the first is that experience is cumulative, right? It is not necessarily transformational. Certainly there are transformational experiences in life, but most of the experiences we have are minor and may go unnoticed, right? We may not even recognize them as experiences. For Dewey, having a meal could be an experience, having an argument could be an experience, right? And these experiences build up, right? You know that every moment in your life has led to this moment. Everything in your life has led to this moment. Everything in your life has led to every moment, right? So that's the idea. Experiences are cumulative. Context matters. And this is one of those things that those studies kept pointing towards. It matters who says it. It matters how you hear it. It matters who you were with, what you were doing, what your values are. All of these things matter, right, to science communication. So everything that's happened before and everything that's happening now are all part of what's being communicated, right? So in science communication, context matters. Right? And finally, audiences have agency, right? This is, I think, one of the big mistakes of the deficit model and one of the reasons it sort of has the bad rep that it has now, right? We never are simply passive receivers of information. That's never what happens. We're always, everything we hear, we're interpreting, we're making meaning of in reference to our own lives. We accept or we reject everything that we hear, everything that we experience. We have some agency in interpreting the meaning of that, right? You cannot give someone an experience. You can present opportunities for people to have experiences, but you don't give people experiences. You don't give people knowledge, right? So this is all kind of vague and abstract, right? And so in the book project that I'm working on, I talk about how this is applicable in terms of research, how science communication research can use this, how we can use this in practice, right? And how we can use this in one aspect of practice that's particularly important in science comm, evaluation and assessment, which comes up all the time. So I don't have time to talk about all of those today. So I'm primarily going to talk about research, how we use this in research, but also a little bit more about how we use this in evaluation, because that's some of the work that I'm doing right now, and I'm thinking it's really interesting, and you might be interested in that. So. Researching experience. When we research experience, I think one of the things we have the opportunity to do is to look at context, to see about what kinds of experiences and what other factors are contributing to the context in which a particular moment of science communication happens. So I'm going to start with a fairly simple concept. Does anybody remember when they studied germ theory in maybe high school biology or junior high biology? Do you remember any lessons on germ theory? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So probably not, right? So there might be some exceptions, but for the most part, it was a very small part of our education. We didn't really think about it or talk about it a lot. Anyone remember the last time they saw a sign that looked like that? Yeah, right? They're everywhere. These are ubiquitous. So our contact with the moments that we see or are reminded of germ theory are multitudes. There's so many of them. They're ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's from when you're a young child and your parents are teaching you, as we're teaching our son now, to wash your hands, right, before you eat. Wash your hands after you go to the restroom. We see signs on restroom doors. We see public service announcements. We see commercials, a lot of commercials, in which germs are anthropomorphized into monsters, right? And I've searched and searched for this, but I have a very specific memory of a Clorox commercial in which the sheet got off the bed and chased people through the house because they had not used Clorox, right? So we have these messages everywhere. Here's another one. Your cell phone is covered with nasties, right? Another common thing that we see in advertisements for cleaning products are these wonderful, very scientific looking magnified visions or sometimes petri dishes that will be full of just nasties. And then there will be only one or two left, right? And these are part of our consciousness, part of the experiences we've had with germ theory, right? But it's not about the information conveyed about in these, right? That's not what we think about. We think about what they mean to us. What they mean in terms of cleanliness, right? In terms of how are we clean? How do we become clean? In terms of morality, right? There's morality attached to cleanliness. Most of the cleaning products we see, ads full of women who are cleaning houses. That's been changing lately. Who do we see in these commercials? It tells us something about who we're supposed to be, right? And so there's a lot of meaning wrapped up in cleanliness. That's very simply part of who we are and part of how we make meaning of the world, how we understand the world, how we experience the world, just from the background noise of these kinds of commercials, right? So that's a kind of small, simple case that could go anywhere. There's a lot of room for interesting questions. But the thing that I get asked most about when I give my elevator pitch for this idea is, well, what about vaccine apprehension? What about anti-vaxxers, right? What do you have to say about anti-vaxxers? And this wasn't an area of research for me before, but because I got asked so much, I did a little thought experiment, and it ended up with some really rich ideas. So I want to approach this particularly from the perspective of women who are pregnant or about to become pregnant or have just had their first child, women who have gone through pregnancy, because a lot of the research suggests that women, upper middle class women who are rejecting vaccinations, people who are rejecting vaccinations, it's the mothers who have gone through very specific Western experiences of pregnancy, right? So I want to look at some of the other experiences that lead up to vaccine apprehension, that come before it, that aren't necessarily related, because there's a lot of really excellent research out there about how people make the decision, about how to approach discussions about vaccinations. Dean Largent has written a book about this. There's a field full of research, but I want to consider the lived experience of these women who are opting not to vaccinate their children. So this is the narrative, right? We've all seen before. We have the irrational anti-vaccine activist and the scientist who spouts the facts and says, this should end the matter. We shouldn't have to discuss it any further, right? These are the caricatures that we begin with. But how do they get to that point, right? Let's start with pregnancy itself. Tips for a successful pregnancy. Successful presumably means pregnancy resulting in a healthy child, right? There are lots of tips and a lot of directions for how to behave, for how to control your body when you are pregnant. And pregnant women report, and my memory of this is in line with that, that a lot of people will tell them these rules in a lot of contexts, right? So much so that this is reported as scaremongering at times, that another list of pregnancy tips that doesn't help, that we see contradictory pregnancy tips, different rules for pregnancy in different countries and different cultures, right? But all of these things presume that pregnancy is a medical condition that must be treated and that we have to think about it in these specific ways. So as an example, I know you can't quite see the top. Can pregnant women eat that? What am I allowed to eat? Is the first thing that says. You can enjoy these in moderation and absolutely avoid at all costs, right? What not to eat when pregnant, right? 10 foods not to eat in pregnancy. This is a lot of what we're told as pregnant women to do with our bodies. Some of these are grounded in specific research. There is so much research done on alcohol, whether or not to drink alcohol when you're pregnant, and these rules change frequently. There's research done on caffeine in pregnancy. And so you're to avoid caffeine or limit caffeine. Some of the other ones, fish. Limit your intake of fish due specifically to the risk of mercury. Limit your intake of, don't eat sushi or soft cheeses because these things may contain foodborne illnesses. Another one was Advil. Don't take Advil. Can cause a risk of miscarriage and early pregnancy. And my personal favorite, do not drink herbal tea. Not because there are any studies that show that it might be a risky behavior, but because there are no studies saying that it's not, right? So the sum of all of this wisdom is that it is your job, before your child is a child, when your child is a fetus, to eliminate all risk. That is your job, to eliminate all risk to this fetus at all costs, at cost to your personal well-being, right? So there's one of the challenges I faced was I take a particular asthma medication. And my doctor said, well, I can't tell you whether or not you should take it because, there are risks inherent in it, but there's also risks inherent in not being able to breathe while you're pregnant. And so I was left with that decision. So the way that we talk about risk and elimination of risk as the ideal is part of how we make meaning of our role, right? As parents, as the ones who are deciding whether or not to vaccinate. Okay, leaving aside pregnancy. Since the 1960s, in the United States, direct-to-consumer marketing of prescription drugs has been legal, right? And this is something that the American Medical Association's fought against. They've fought for regulations on how these can be advertised, and this is an ongoing concern. But they are legal. So we see advertisements for and commercials for sleeping pills, prescription sleeping pills, and we're told, ask your doctor, right? Ask your doctor about. For erectile dysfunction, for birth control, for medications for children, for ADD, right? This is Concerta, a medication for ADHD. So these are advertised to us in the same places, right, that we see advertisements for cleaners, right, germ theory, that we see advertisements for the next new phone, that we see advertisements for potato chips, right? They are consumer products. These are consumer products. You have to ask your doctor about them, but it's our right as consumers to know our options and to pick the one we want. So we start to see a tension here between our role as consumers and our role as patients, right? But we are consumers, we should pick the experience we want and talk to our doctor about it, right? So we have these consumer products on the market, but there's a lot associated with the companies that sell them. So even if you're not following the Sacklers scandal and the connection between Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis, even if you're not following that and you don't know what's going on, and all of the newest reports coming out that they're trying to hide money and go bankrupt so they won't have to pay out, most people heard about PharmaBro, right? Martin Shkreli, PharmaBro. This is a part of our cultural narrative that these are the kinds of people that run pharmaceutical companies, right? Right after his story broke, the story broke about the jacking up the prices of EpiPens, right, to $500 an EpiPen. And so not only are we consumers deciding which products to use, we're deciding from companies that are inherently corrupt. Or if they're not corrupt, they might be negligent, right? There's another factor in this, which is how many people have seen late night television commercials for class action lawsuits, right? Those class action lawsuits for medications. And once again, in 2016, the American Medical Association was trying really hard to get some kind of regulation put on what these could do, because apparently they have reports, or they believe that this is causing seniors to stop taking their medicines, when they see these commercials because they're afraid of the consequences. And so that's also part of our narrative, right? So taken together, so if we take all of these things together and we talk about the lived experience of pregnancy, we get to something like this, right? You should be concerned. Every U.S. manufacturer or supplier of pediatric vaccines has pled guilty to fraud. Now, it doesn't matter if this is true, right? At this point, it doesn't matter if this is true. What matters is that our lived experience tells us that this could be true. It very well could be true. It easily could be true, right? So the bottom line is that, let me see, I have a nice list somewhere. I have a nice list somewhere. So it's so the first thing is that we must eliminate all risk, right? So that's the first part. The second part is we are patients with a condition called pregnancy, but also consumers who must decide which products will help us have the most successful pregnancy, right? Also, we can pick and choose what we want in terms of these products, but we have to recognize that they are from corporate or negligent companies. So by the time we get to the room where we're talking about vaccination, we've missed the mark, we've missed the boat, right? So what does this tell us for research? It opens us up to a world of new questions to ask, right? Where we're not just asking about that interaction between the doctor and the patient when the patient says, I don't want to vaccinate, right? We're not just talking about that moment. We're talking about the ways we talk about risk with women in terms of pregnancies and how that is related. We're talking about our relationship with pharmaceutical companies, whether or not there should be direct-to-consumer marketing for prescription medications. We're talking about things that go beyond the scope of science communication, but through this kind of inquiry can be brought to bear in discussions of science communication, right? So it broadens the questions we ask, it broadens the understanding. Okay, so that is one of the ways that I hope an experience model can help lead us to down interesting paths for science communication research. In terms of, how much time do I have left? Anyone know? Okay, I won't worry about it. In terms of practice, experience model in practice, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the idea of expression versus explanation, but I'm gonna jump to evaluation, which is part of practice, because I wanna talk about the research that I've been doing there recently. So when Dewey talks about art as experience, he talks about the role of the artist as someone who is engaged in an active expression, right? And in that active expression, they create the expressive object, and it is that object with which audiences interact and have experiences. So acts of expressions are themselves aesthetic experiences, right? If you're not engaged in some kinds of aesthetic experiences through the creation or generation of this, it probably means you're not engaged in an active expression. That is in itself an experience. It begins with what Dewey calls an impulsion, which he says is distinct from an impulse. It's not just an emotional drive, right? An impulsion is a deep need that has emotion attached to it, but is based on something more than simply emotion, right? And that impulsion interacts with the material world. In the case of science communication, that generally means knowledge and products of knowledge. It interacts with those, and it is expressed through a medium, right? Dewey says acts of expression generate expressive objects that clarify and concentrate meanings. So it brings together an idea, right? That is, once again, that sense of wholeness or that sense of fulfillment, and provides opportunities for experiences in which audiences can make meaning. And so I want to talk about this in terms of physics demonstrations. So this is a project that I began last year with Dr. Katie Hinko, who's a physicist in Lyman Briggs College in the Physics and Astronomy Department. We're working with an undergrad research assistant, Sydney Sees. We wanted to look broadly at science demonstrations, but specifically at physics demonstrations. So some of the literature on physics demonstrations suggests that they do generate interest and excitement, but they may aid understanding if audiences are asked to make predictions of whether or not they're right or wrong. But there's not really a lot of significance showing that they do that. And there's really no evidence that they aid in retention. So there's been some calls to say, okay, well, let's not use them. If they don't help students learn, let's not use them. And then there's been, a sort of strong resistance to that because they're such a deeply entrenched part of the experience of learning science. So I'm talking about demonstrations both in the classroom and in informal science settings. So things like freezing a rose in liquid nitrogen and then shattering it, right? Other kinds of physical demonstrations of scientific concepts. That was Bill Nye the Science Guy or Mr. Wizard if you're older like me. That was the sort of fodder for those shows. Right? So we wanted to ask, what could this experience model do to help us understand what's happening in these kinds of activities, in these demonstrations? So I'm going to go back to this picture. So we studied the science theater troupe here at Michigan State. It's a troupe of undergraduate students. They run themselves, and they do demonstrations for K through 12, primarily elementary schools. And they go into classrooms or they go into museums, and they have a series of demonstrations that they do. So we observed about 10 of their demonstrations, and Sydney, our undergrad research assistant, interviewed, I think, 12 of them. So she did 12 interviews with these students. And 2 of their demonstrations, I'm going to see if I wonder if I have sound. I don't think I have sound, but it's okay, I don't really need it. There are 2 of these demonstrations, one that they call Marshmallow Smashies, and the other one that they call Bernoulli's Principle, really rose to the top as their favorite demonstrations. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos of these demonstrations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found. So this is Marshmallow Smashies, and the way it's set up is, such a funny name, is that you have, I wonder if this, yeah. So here is the beaker here is attached to a vacuum pump that's going to suck out the air, and there are several marshmallows in the beaker. Before the marshmallows went in, the students had a chance to name them and draw faces on them. So there are faces on these marshmallows. So here's what happens. So you can hear children like, ooh, ah, and you can see when he sucks out the air, the marshmallows expand, and then he releases it and they shrink down again, right? So it's pretty straightforward. So that's the whole demonstration. And the next one, Bernoulli's Principle, and I'm gonna disclose this is my son. We don't have permission to videotape children without filling out forms with their parents, and it's very hard to get that kind of access. So that's why the other videos don't have kids. This is mine, so I give my consent. This is Bernoulli's Principle. So what you see is the child has a wand that has a bunch of streamers hanging off of it, right, streamers, and they're going to ask him how the ball is staying in the air. So they've got a leaf blower that's holding the ball up in the air. So how is the ball staying up in the air? Is the air flowing underneath it or over it? And you're going to see first they try underneath, so he holds it underneath, and nothing happens. So they tell him, hold it up above, and we see that the airflow is going over the beach ball, and that's what's keeping it in the air. Okay, so so these 2 were singled out as their favorite things to do with the students, and you can hear from the students. I wish we did have sound, so you can hear from with the students. Responses the moment when they have that experience, right? When they're like, oh my gosh, they're gonna pop, they're saying things like that. so we thought, how do we study this? How do we say something about what's happening here that we could disseminate as assessment or as evaluation? How do we assess if they were having an experience and what the quality of that experience was? So what we ended up doing was that we took the interviews and we did some analysis on the interviews and we pulled out some themes, but then we had Sydney, our undergraduate, write thick descriptions, right? Very detailed descriptions of each of these two demonstrations and how the presenters engaged with them, how the students engaged with them, that included materials from the presenters' interviews about why these were their favorite demonstrations. And what became clear to us, and we said in the paper we just, the proceedings that we just published, that the need for a new language by which we can speak about demonstrations as expressive objects that are imbued with meaning. So some of our evidence for this were that in both of these demonstrations, the children were asked to predict what would happen. And in both, because these were counterintuitive experiments, their predictions were wrong, and that caused delight. Like, that was a delight, right? And so that moment of being proven wrong and thinking it's going to be this really obvious thing, but it turns out to be something else completely, that moment you could actually hear and see the moment of experience, right? Further, we saw that and from our interviews, we saw that the demonstrators took great pains to heighten that moment, right? And to ask, they had them draw the faces on the marshmallows, what's going to happen with the faces. They sort of led them to these suggestions. They did a lot of work to sort of build that moment. So they were building the aesthetic properties into this, right? Also, because they were so excited about these particular demonstrations, they were reliving their own experiences with them and finding again that sense of wonder at, oh, the thing I thought was going to happen didn't happen, right? And so they were, through this expressive object of the demonstration, connecting with the audiences about these ideas. And we think that's a good start in how you start to be able to talk about the value of experience, of an experience like a physics demonstration, and how you start to get to assessment for that, right? So I think I'm probably getting close to being out of time. Let me see. Yeah, so I will stop there for questions. I have a lot more to say, but I think this is a good place to stop for questions. So. I'm going to take a drink of water. Any questions? Mm-hmm.
So, something that surprised me was that you talked about the relationship between the demonstrations and retention.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems counterintuitive to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I know with my girls, whenever I demonstrate something that they're learning in school, it sticks a lot longer than just a mere explanation. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that relationship or the
Sure.
research.
So sure, I can tell you, so the research specifically on physics demonstrations isn't mine, but I can tell you my research that matches this. So it's what's sticking might be the demonstration itself, right? So Dance of Scales, the show that I didn't have time to talk about today, had a moment of, it had a lot of demonstrations built in. There was one that was a physicalization where Itai and Marin, the dancer and the scientist, were trying to demonstrate the way that entropy at the subatomic level is not chaos, but is order. And so the way that they did this, do you guys want to do it? Do you guys mind standing up? I'm going to stand up for a minute. Okay. So stand up, spread out, and you're going to do this. That's all you're going to do. You're a subatomic particle. You're going to do this, right? Just going to keep doing this. Now, take like a step closer to the people next to you. Okay?
Yeah.
And keep stepping up. Yeah, keep stepping closer to the people next to you. Do you find that you are trying to like create symmetry, so you're trying to move together, right? right? If you move together, if you're moving in unison, you're not hitting each other. If you're not moving in unison, you're hitting each other. So this was the demonstration, that subatomic particles in closed spaces, entropy will be order rather than chaos. This is the point that Itai wanted to get across. We interviewed people a month after the show, and they remembered vividly this demonstration, but could not tell you what it meant scientifically, right? Yeah.
Because that's my follow-up question on this.
Mm-hmm.
Who generates the meaning?
Mm-hmm. So it's generated
because the scientist might have a meaning that he wants to convey.
Exactly.
But maybe the audience has other meanings from out of this.
Yeah.
It's not related to what the scientist wanted to
Yeah,
convey.
no, that's exactly it. That's exactly it, right? So we have to let go of some of our assumptions about what retention needs to be, right? Does a general audience who's never going to think about entropy again need to remember precisely what it was that principle enacted, or is it enough that they remember having that experience of bumping into each other and trying to organize themselves, right? And so this is precisely what I mean by this theory, is that in science communication, there's a lot more than just that information. And when we think about meaning, there is going to be a sort of communal sense of shared meaning, but that individuals will make meaning and interpret themselves, right? Ultimately, they have the power to do that. Right, and they can't help but do that. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. Just a small comment about your last slide that talked about the need for a language.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming from the field of science education,
Mm-hmm.
K-12 science education, and practically all the things that you talked about, we have a lot of studies and a lot of terminology that we've been
Mm-hmm.
working on for many years, whether it's embodied learning,
Mm-hmm.
Active learning,
Mm-hmm.
sense making by experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there is a lot that's maybe from a different
Yeah,
parallel field.
there always is, right? Absolutely. So you see K through 12 education, not specifically science education, right? So science education? Okay. So that's interesting. So yeah, and I think, Dewey's work on experience in education is also informative of this, right? I think they're deeply connected. So absolutely, yeah.
You talked about the acts of expression,
Mm-hmm.
and if I understood correctly, it was connected with these sort of physics demonstrations of
Mm-hmm.
acts of expression. I was just curious, do you think there are lessons, say scientists who aren't involved in demonstrations, but
Mm-hmm.
they're like, being interviewed for media, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the case may be. Say they're trying to share about their research in
Yeah.
traditional sorts of ways. Are there things that you would want them to glean from this idea of acts of expression?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the piece I took out this morning. Yeah, absolutely. So there's this idea of thinking about what you want to express as opposed to explain is probably the primary way that I want this to be valuable in practice for scientists, because I'm really aiming to reach researchers as well as scientists who wish to communicate with the book itself. So I talk a lot in the draft of chapter 3, anyway, I talk a lot about engaging in these acts of expression and what it means to make that flip, right? That switch from explanation to expression. And I'm going to bring up dance of scales again. So there were a couple of points of friction as we were developing dance of scales that really what they came down to was a real tension over exactly this idea of explanation versus expression. And in many ways, because of the sort of art science nature, it ended up being a dichotomy, right? It was either we were expressing something or explaining it. And that's not necessarily the case. I think one way to think about it is what kinds of explanations do you need in order to express what it is you need to express. And the other big lesson, the other sort of major takeaway in that section is that an impulsion is not about what you need them to know, but about what you need to say, right? And that stems from this idea that audiences have agency, right? And so if you set out, I talk a lot about in popular science communication, like your Carl Sagans, your Neil Tysons, your Bill Nyes, a lot of what ends up happening is can be characterized as either evangelism or persuasion, right? I need to convince you of something, or I'm going to share, the love of science that I have, and this is, there's a lot of sort of tropes about wonder, and not just the wonder of the cosmos, but the wonder of us as humans being able to understand the cosmos. So these sort of efforts to evangelize science or to persuade people about important controversial topics, part of the reason that there is a boomerang effect, part of the reason that they're falling flat is that that impulsion, that drive comes from a need to, for what you need to hear, for what you need to know, or for what you need to think, rather than from a need for what I need to say. So that's a little taste of the chapter I yanked out for today. Yeah.
A little bit about the use of metaphor and analogies as well, and this idea of them being boundary object. I was wondering if you connect that as well to this idea of experience, because a metaphor and analogy is used normally as a way to relate to an experience for yourself.
So I haven't. So you're referring to the work that some of the art science work that I do, right? So another area of my study is these art science collaborations and what happens. One of the things I talk about is the development of boundary objects in these collaborations, and metaphors are sometimes one such boundary object that can be used. I haven't connected them, but what I would say is that I think. Once again, it's about that sort of shift of the metaphor as a way of explaining the concept to the metaphor itself being a part of the expression, or being the expressive object, right? And what concept is it that you need, or what information is it that you need to make that metaphor meaningful, right? And so again, it's really a subtle difference, a subtle distinction, but I think a really important one that addresses this question of why can't we get away from deficit model thinking in science comm. So.
I think this is more of a clarification question, because that one quote you had from Dewey about values and turning the artist experience into a tacit, can you put that quote back up?
Sure. Let me see. It might not be a quote from Dewey. It might be.
Well, that would make sense in why my confusion.
This one?
Yeah.
That's not Dewey. That's me. I'm quoting myself. I'm cheating.
But what I think is interesting, and especially by the end of your talk, the message really is all about embracing the values. So like the value of, are you seeing entropy, or are you seeing the fact that, I get to be close to my friend Susan? And so what value is in it for the person?
Yeah, precisely.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
So that's what, okay.
That precisely. So I think in the past we've conceptualized, and certainly while we were making Dance of Scales, and this was one of the tensions we ran into, is that this moment ended up getting talked about in the room as a way that movement was helping to illustrate or explain science. And certainly Maren wanted to, the dancer wanted to engage in this audience participation moment, because for her it was meaningful and important to see people moving together, right? And to not be the only one in the space moving. She also insisted that, so Itai danced with her on stage. He was probably the only physicist I'll ever get to do barefoot modern dance on stage. But she also insisted we dance. I was horrified, did not want to, but if I was making the physicist dance, how could I say no? So we were on stage dancing at certain points as well. But for her, that was very important. But when it came to talking about and thinking about that moment, we thought about it as, well, here's how we're explaining this concept, instead of as an act of expression. So if we shift that value and embrace what was meaningful about that, then it feels much more successful to us anyway, because a month later, people remembered that. That was meaningful to them. But the actual words to describe what was happening scientifically, so.
So what should be the goal of these demonstrations then?
So what should be the goal of these demonstrations? So I would leave that up to the demonstrators, right? I would say in different contexts, they have different goals.
If we know, research shows that whatever concepts that the science teacher, science demonstrations want to give to the audience, communicate to the audience, that's not retained. Then what's the goal of the demonstration?
To me, the goal is that the experience is retained, right? And they've had that experience, and it's now part of lived experience, right? And even though it's not transformational, it's just that time that we did that crazy thing and had to stand up and get really close to each other at that one show. It's still a part of lived experience, right? And these things are cumulative. So it seems like a pretty good experience. Seems worth doing. It's more than just excitement. There's something meaningful about that, about trying to make something happen with the people around you and to wrap your mind around something, and there's something kind of beautiful when you get it, right? So.
And to that point, can you discuss like, Dylan giving the Bernoulli's principle? It's okay, but.
You want me to say what he said? So we asked Dylan afterwards what he was doing and when he went, because he was so excited that he got chosen to demonstrate the principle, and he said we were trying to figure out. I can't remember the exact words of whether I was going up or over or above. And I said, "Oh, so were you pretending to be scientists?" And he said, "No, we were scientists." He was very indignant. So that and that actually correlates with one of the. There are 6 strands of informal science learning, right? And one of them is one of them is being able to see oneself as a scientist. So it correlates with sort of the best practices in informal science learning. In that moment, that experience led him to see himself as a scientist. So. Yeah, he remembers the air. Yeah, but he won't remember Bernoulli's principle. He won't remember the details of it. Yeah, but he remembers that experience, and that's part of his meaning making about the world is that time he got to be a scientist, right? And he has a lot of those because he's got parents who dig that kind of stuff. So, all right. Thank you very much. Yep. Thank you everybody for coming. It's a good turnout.
Stay for as long as you like.